Good morning. In less than 3 months, the Winter Olympics will begin in Beijing. According to media reports, the Biden administration is prepared to announce a diplomatic boycott. This is the absolute bare minimum that any civilized nation would do for these genocide Olympics. I'm here today to call on the Biden administration to mount a complete and total boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics. No athletes, no administration officials, no corporate sponsors. I call for this boycott on two separate grounds. First, to protect the safety and the security of our athletes. 5 months ago, I wrote to the Biden administration to ask them what their plan was to protect our athletes in communist China. They delayed their answer. They recently sent me an answer, only through restricted channels, even though there was nothing classified in their answer. And the sum total of their response to my letter was they have no plan. They have no plan to protect our athletes and their coaches and their staff from the very real and very concrete dangers that I outlined last June. First, ubiquitous surveillance. The surveillance of our athletes in their dorm rooms, in their bathrooms, in their practice facilities, their cell phones, other electronic devices. Second, DNA harvesting. The Chinese Communist Party wants to corner the market and lead the world on genetic data testing and harvesting to advance their life science technology research in many fields. They may even use COVID-19 tests as a way to harvest DNA from our world-class athletes. Third, from simple hostage-taking. We've seen with the recent case of the Huawei settlement that the Chinese Communist Party is more than willing to take hostages of Westerners to advance their own diplomatic or economic goals. Again, the Biden administration has laid out no plan how to protect our athletes from the Chinese communists. And second, we should boycott these games because of China's crimes against the United States and the civilized world and its own people. China runs a totalitarian slave state in which they keep hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of religious and ethnic minorities in gulags, subjecting them to slave labor, subjecting ethnic women to mass rape and sterilization as a form of ethnic cleansing. They harvest organs from dissidents and ethnic and religious minorities. They've also cracked down on Hong Kong, denying Hong Kongers their autonomy that was guaranteed under China's international obligations, to say nothing of the fact that China unleashed a plague on the world that has killed millions of people and has disrupted the lives of every American. For these reasons, the safety and security of our own athletes and China's crimes against the world, we should launch a complete and total boycott of China's Genocide Olympics. I regret that this will prevent about 300 of America's world-class athletes from competing in the Olympics. I sympathize with them. However, they have been failed by this administration, who months ago, could have worked with our allies to develop a plan to conduct these games in another country. They've been failed by the leaders of the International Olympic movement, who should have never awarded these games to a communist tyranny. So today, I call on the Biden administration to boycott the Chinese Winter Olympics. I'll now take your questions.
You mentioned it briefly, but what is your message, though, to all those athletes who have worked hard for so long to go to these Winter Games? And also, it didn't seem like from 1980, the only people who were penalized at the end of the day were the athletes. So how do you rectify it? What do you tell them?
Well, again, I sympathize with the approximately 300 athletes who are going to compete in these games for the United States, should we compete. I regret that it's come to this. But the responsibility for a boycott rests on the failures of the Biden administration. Many senators, for many months, have been calling on the Biden administration to relocate these games. That was feasible. The Winter Olympics are far smaller than the Summer Olympics. There's probably half a dozen countries in the world today that could host the Winter Olympics on 6 months or 12 months' notice. The Biden administration didn't take those steps. They probably didn't take them because they wanted Xi Jinping's cooperation at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that the administration only leaked its plans of a so-called diplomatic boycott after that climate change conference ended. And second, the blame rests with the International Olympic movement, who should not award games to communist tyrannies. So again, I regret that these athletes would not have the opportunity to compete in these Olympics. I hope that most of them would be able to compete in Italy in 2026. But the blame rests on the Biden administration for failing to lead, for failing to protect our own athletes while they're in China, and on the leaders of the International Olympic movement.
Two questions. First, I know you said a diplomatic boycott is the minimum, but are you supportive of Senator Young and others' amendments to include that language in the NDAA? And separately on the NDAA, can you give us any update on your efforts to try to amend the legislation requiring women to be drafted?
So first, I do support legislative efforts to impose a diplomatic, and I would add economic boycott. Corporate sponsors of these games should not be traveling to celebrate Chinese communists. However, that is probably going to be too little and too late. And now it's not enough either. The administration made clear in their response to my June letter that they obviously do not have a plan to protect our athletes from the threats that the Chinese Communist Party poses to them. Ubiquitous surveillance and DNA harvesting, or even hostage taking. So it's too little and too late at this point.
Hi, so I'm wondering, do you think that by not taking this action, if they decide not to do the diplomatic boycott, or they don't take even stronger action, do you think that's in some way indirectly supporting these human rights abuses?
Well, I can only assume the Biden administration is at least going to announce a diplomatic boycott. Again, I believe that they waited until after the Glasgow Climate Change Conference to announce it because they didn't want to offend Xi Jinping beforehand. But now, having floated that trial balloon, if they in fact don't announce that diplomatic boycott, if they allow the Secretary of State or the Vice President or someone else to lead a delegation to China, I think it would be an appalling lack of judgment and failure of moral leadership to support with a diplomatic presence the Chinese Communist Party, which is committing genocide against its own people. And that's not just a judgment I've made, that's a judgment that Joe Biden's State Department has made.
One more question for you. So you mentioned the organ harvesting, and this is a really crucial issue, particularly with Falun Gong practitioners in China. I know there's been some resolution here in Congress to help this issue, to condemn the issue. Why do you think that it hasn't moved forward, and what can the U.S. do to help this move forward?
Well, unfortunately, you have a lot of panda huggers in Congress who don't want to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party and who are carrying water for the Biden administration, who care more about things like getting Xi Jinping to make some fantastical promise about carbon emissions 30 years in the future, or to buy cheap solar panels that probably won't work, as most things from China don't work, as part of their big Green New Deal. So you've got a lot of panda huggers in Congress who are prioritizing these areas of what they perceive as needed cooperation with the Chinese communists, as opposed to standing up to a nation committing genocide against its own people.
Do you think that the administration could also take an action sooner to urge a new location? You know, with a year's notice, it gets more difficult.
So the Trump administration took a much firmer stand on some of these issues, like announcing that it was a genocide against the religious and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang province, or imposing sanctions for those Chinese officials who cracked down in Hong Kong. I would have supported earlier action. It is feasible, though. It would have been feasible to move these Olympics as early as January, even the summer. Again, these are the Winter Olympics we're talking about, not the Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics are far smaller scale than are the Summer Olympics. And if the Biden administration had taken it seriously from the very beginning, if they had rallied support of our allies, I'm confident we could have found a free and democratic country that could have hosted these Winter Olympics on short notice.
So just for clarification, do you think that it would have been possible, or would you have supported some sort of U.S. athletes going to China under certain circumstances, or is your opposition?
So my first concern is always the safety and security of the American people, to include these world-class athletes and their coaches and their staff. That's why in June, when I inquired of the Biden administration what their plan was to protect our athletes, at the time I called for a diplomatic and economic boycott. I wasn't yet prepared to call for a complete and total boycott to include our athletes and their teams. I wanted the Biden administration to have a chance to outline their plans to protect them. But they've made clear now that they do not have a plan to protect them from things like DNA harvesting or ubiquitous surveillance or hostage taking. And we cannot put the lives and the safety of our athletes and their coaches and their support staff at risk in China.
So it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, and clarify me if I'm wrong, is that you weren't thrilled with the idea of the Chinese Olympics in general, but that with certain provisions in place, you would have been okay with
Well,
it.
I've never been thrilled with the prospect of any Olympic Games being held in China. But the absolute responsibility of the United States government is to protect our citizens. And the Biden administration does not have a competent plan to protect our athletes and their coaches and their staff. The same gang that organized the withdrawal from Kabul is the gang that's in charge of the safety of these Olympians, and that's not a risk we should run.
Can I just follow up on my previous question about when it is a draft?
Yes, I forgot about you.
Whether you all got a vote on the amendment.
I hope we should have a vote on this. This is a serious change of military policy, and we should have a vote, and all senators should go on the record about whether they think we should be drafting America's daughters in the military against their will.
So you insist on that vote happening?
I think we should have an amendment. I believe that we are close to getting agreement on amendment to have a vote, but I think we should have that vote, and it should be an up or down vote. I don't want to keep people here through Thanksgiving. I don't want to keep people here longer than necessary. I just wish that we could have votes up or down on these important and consequential policy changes before they go into law.
Senator Cotton, so aside from the security issues and condemning the human rights abuses, do you think it also has an important signaling aspect by allowing for this diplomatic boycott? Because do you think American people are starting to actually wake up to this threat, and that this would also allow them to see more?
Well, the American people have been alive to the threat of China for a very long time. I mean, China has been stealing our jobs and taking our factories for decades. They've been putting our troops at risk and our allies and partners at risk for decades. The American people are right that China is responsible for unleashing this plague on the world. So the American people are well ahead of where the Biden administration is on this question. And like me, I'm sure all Americans believe that it would be very sad if our athletes can't compete in the Beijing Olympics. But they shouldn't have been awarded by the international Olympic movement in the first place, and the Biden administration should have had a better plan in advance to either protect our athletes in China or to move the games elsewhere. All right. If there are no other questions, thank you.
Our biggest national security threat is Communist China, the party, the government of Communist China, whether it's covering up the COVID-19 virus, stealing our jobs or technology, putting 1 million people in prison for their religion, harvesting organs involuntarily, taking away the basic rights of Hong Kong citizens. They're a despicable government. We all have to figure out how are we going to compete against Communist China. We clearly have a new Cold War. So I think it's important for all Americans to stop buying Chinese products. It's important for all of us to understand that we're in a fight for the future of this country. On top of that, we have the opportunity to move the Olympics. The Olympics are going to be held, the Winter Olympics, in Communist China in 22. They ought to be moved to the United States.
Much, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us together on this very important issue. It's about our values. It's about who we are as a country. It's about more than words. It's about actions. Thank you. And I thank you for the years of service that you have given to this. You never have faltered in all of it. I myself have lost my innocence on expecting people to behave in a way that is consistent with their words when it comes to respecting human rights. But matters have only gotten worse in China, as you have pointed out. And the genocide, recognized as a genocide, should be reason for us to change our actions. But it's been an honor to serve with you, with Frank Wolf over the years, and I thank you for calling forth the bipartisanship of this to Senator Merkley. It is Jim McGovern as has Chris Smith, been a relentless, persistent advocate for human rights in China, well, throughout the world. But I've seen him in action, speaking to the leadership of China, going to Tibet, undermining the misrepresentation that the Chinese are making about what is going on in Tibet. You talked about Hong Kong, we talked about human rights throughout China. But now this rises to the level of recognized genocide. So when I hear Senator Merkley, I'm so excited that we are reinvigorated with a new, strong voice on all of this and acknowledge the work of Senator Rubio in all of this. As you both have said, this has always been bipartisan, and that is its strength. And not only is it bipartisan, but we have built our trust that serves us well in other aspects of our lives in the Congress. Okay, so here we are with the Olympics coming up. The Olympics were held in Germany when Hitler was in charge. And what did he say at the time? Who's ever heard? Does anybody remember the Armenians? Remember he said that when they were executing the Holocaust. So it just seems so strange that we would have history repeat itself. But let me just say this. As I said, I've kind of lost my innocence on hoping that corporate America or the powers that be would ever be consistent in what they have said and actions they have taken. I want to join our two co-chairs and Senator Merkley for all three of you for welcoming this distinguished panel. We want to get to them as soon as we can. But we cannot proceed as if nothing is wrong about the Olympics going to China. That may be a fait accompli. It may not be possible to stop that. The last 3 decades have made it clear that we cannot continue to give Beijing a blank check on the hope that their behavior will simply change. As you said, Mr. Chairman, that doesn't happen. When the international community said, let's wait and see, yeah, we wait and saw, and the Chinese proceeded as normal. This is what I do know, because sadly, this is not the first time that Congress and the international community have held this debate. As Mr. Smith mentioned, back in 1993, we all joined Tom Lantos in passing legislation urging the IOC to reject China's 2000 bid for the Summer Olympics because of massive violation of human rights. They did not get it that year, I don't know because of us, but because Sydney prevailed. Then in 2001, again, we joined Tom Lantos and Chris Cox on the Republican side of the aisle to oppose China's 2008 bid, stating the Olympic spirit is built upon peace and respect, as Senator Merkley has said, peace and respect for universal fundamental ethical principles. Sadly, we are here because the Chinese government continues to crush all political dissent and trample basic human rights of its people. Then in 2008, after returning from Dharamsala, where our congressional delegation was received by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, again, we spoke out calling on President Bush to boycott the opening ceremonies and opposing the torch, and I opposed the torch relay in San Francisco. Unfortunately, President Bush did go to them, but I do want to point out that he did attend our ceremony in the Capitol. We gave the Congressional Gold Medal to the Dalai Lama, which made the Chinese unhappy. And as we know, a similarly disappointing debate took place in the 1990s with China's WTO accession, was simply giving China a blank check as it failed to comply with market commitments. In this very room, the Speaker's conference room, I welcome the chairman of the Chinese People's Congress in this very room. And when I said to him, you're in violation of the WTO provisions, this in relationship to rubber, at the time he said, when we joined, he and his heads of the committees from the China People's Congress, they said, when we joined the WTO, they said we did not have to obey those rules. So we've given them, again, a free ride. Today, we once again have an opportunity, obligation to speak out. While China has changed over 30 years in some respects, it is appalling that its human rights record has worsened. The U.S. Congress has and will continue our long bipartisan and bicameral commitment to holding China accountable in this arena as with all others. Over the past 2 years, working together, and Senator Rubio very much a part of this, we passed and signed into law the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020, and I want to acknowledge our Congresswoman Weston for her involvement in all of this. I know she represents a strong Uyghur population in our country. We passed the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. We passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. And already in this Congress, we passed a resolution condemning the ongoing violation of Hong Kong's rights in Hong Kong by Beijing and the government of Hong Kong. We reintroduced the Uyghur Forced Labor Disclosure Act and Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention, and we'll soon take up another legislation urging Uyghur Human Rights Protection Act. This is all in a bipartisan, bicameral way. As Mr. Smith mentioned, the names of some of the prisoners. For the Chinese government, the most excruciating form of torture is to say to the prisoners, nobody cares, nobody even remembers you're here, and they don't know why. Why don't you just give up? But thank you for your mention, and of course, Wei Jinsheng was a hero. Just we nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. He's so fabulous, and now in the U.S., but a victim of China's human rights violations, a real hero to all of us. And he tells us when we speak out, people do hear it in the prisons and in the rest. Again, as I've said, if we don't speak out against human rights violations in China for commercial reasons, we lose all moral authority to speak out for human rights anywhere. So how sad it is to see the Olympic corporate sponsors look the other way on China's abuses out of concern for their bottom line, with some even lobbying against the bipartisan Uyghur forced labor bill. Imagine they're lobbying against a bill of forced labor when our country has declared this a genocide. Here's what I propose, and join those who are proposing, is a diplomatic boycott. I don't know if it's possible because we have not succeeded in the past, and I'm a big sports fan. I watch the Olympics in the middle of the night. If you ever see me during Olympic season, I'm never sleeping. I'm always watching because usually it's in a different time zone. And to see the discipline, the focus, the dedication of our athletes out there is just a source of such pride. Let's honor them at home. Let's not honor the Chinese government by having heads of state go to China to show their support for their athletes. When they come home, let's show them even more. Not you're home now, it's over, goodbye, but even more respect, adulation, really, for what they've done, and to honor all of them, not just the medal winners. But for heads of state to go to China in light of a genocide that is ongoing while you're sitting there in your seats, it really begs the question, what moral authority do you have to speak again about human rights any place in the world if you're willing to pay your respects to the Chinese government as they commit genocide? So honor your athletes at home. Let's have a diplomatic boycott if, in fact, this Olympics takes place. Silence on this issue is unacceptable. It enables China's abuses. Let me end by quoting from testimony submitted today from the International Campaign for Tibet, since Mr. Chairman quoted some of the others. The history of human rights violations has taught us a clear lesson. Silence equates with license, and that those who turn away from crimes against humanity bear responsibility for them. If the AOC does nothing to address irrefutable, decades-long, persistent, severe human rights violations in Olympic host countries like China, it becomes complicit. Now the Chinese Olympic Committee has established new standards and the rest. I understand that, but they maintain that they passed those new rules after they awarded China so let's hope that for the future, those new rules. I just want to go back to our friend Tom Lantos. Years ago, I mean, after like 10 years of doing this and still not really having as much success as we would like to have in terms of human rights in China. And by the way, it's about proliferation of weapons and delivery systems that were to rogue nations. It's about violations of our trade relations. It's about a lot of things, including the human rights violations. When I said to him, I said, Tom, we're not making any success. He said, Nancy said, the road on human rights is a long one. You must be patient. You must be patient, but you must be persistent. And in the spirit of Tom Lantos, which I know Mr. McGovern and Mr. Smith both are in the leadership of the Tom Lantos Commission. Thank you for your chairmanship, Mr. I mean, it is a long road, and we must be patient. But we want some successes as well, and I think one would be if the countries of the world withhold their attendance at the Olympics and instead save their energy and their enthusiasm for their athletes to welcome them when they come home and give them a beautiful send-off when they go. That would be a giant step forward. I've been told by President Trump that President Xi told him that the people in these education camps, the Uyghur education, really like being there. Really like being there. No, they don't, President Xi. They don't like being there. They like being home with their families. So again, I thank all of you for your courage, for your leadership, for the clarity of the message, and I'm very, very proud of the bipartisanship that has been central to this. Bipartisan House and Senate, bipartisan, bicameral, all-American support for human rights throughout the world. Thank you all for your leadership.
Which addresses a very important issue in the world, which is the issue of governments that undertake to destroy populations either in other countries or within their own country. That is to commit genocide. Now this topic comes up because China is committing genocide against its own Uyghur population. 1 million Uyghurs who are enslaved, who are tracked, who are assaulted in every possible way by the official authorities operating out of Beijing. The finding of genocide is one that the State Department takes very seriously. It involves long investigations, collection of evidence, analysis, because it's not something to say lightly. But we now have 2 secretaries of state who have led our State Department through this process and reached the same conclusion. Secretary Pompeo under President Trump and Secretary Blinken under President Biden, and both find that this is in fact genocide. Now at this very moment, athletes are preparing to compete in the Olympic Games in China. And I find it horrific that the prestige of the Games is going to be carried on for a country that is committing genocide. Now we have a commission that works on human rights issues known as the Congressional Executive Commission on China. And it has a whole team of experts that work to analyze human rights issues. And this commission, that's bipartisan and bicameral, and includes executive branch appointees when they are actually appointed, has held a hearing. And at that hearing, various experts came and testified on what China is doing. And it reinforced what Secretary of State under our former president and Secretary of State under our current president found. Genocide is being conducted by the government of China against the Uyghur population. And that's not all China's doing. There's other afflicted groups that it is assaulting. And in addition, it has proceeded to start stripping the political rights of the people of Hong Kong. Very much in the news. We've seen the citizens protesting in the street, hundreds of thousands, saying, China, honor the commitment you made when Britain transferred Hong Kong back under a 50-year agreement to China. And China has not honored that agreement. Now, China, when it was awarded the Games back in 2015 to be held in 2022, 7 years in advance, made human rights promises to the International Olympic Committee, promises that have not been upheld. And in fact, during those years, China has become a much worse violator of human rights in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang and in other ethnic areas, including Tibet. So, we have echoes of 1936, the year the Summer Olympics were held in Germany and Hitler was in charge. And he used those Olympic Games to shine prestige on his country and to essentially help distract enormously from his already horrific actions against Jewish Germans and other groups within Germany. So how is it here, nearly a century later, that again the Olympics are going to be used to shine a little bit of light and a lot of prestige on a country engaged in genocide? I want to compliment my colleague, Senator Romney of Utah. He has placed in the underlying bill, as it came out of Foreign Relations Committee, a provision that says when the Olympics are held, there should be a diplomatic boycott to protest and draw attention to this egregious situation. I hope also the sponsors of those games will start to withdraw their sponsorships. Now, my friend and colleague, Senator Romney, is an expert on the Olympic Games because he organized the Olympic Games in Utah. Nobody in America probably knows more about what it takes to prepare for them. And it is not at this moment possible for the structure that's been established to host the athletes to be redone and to pivot for just next year, which I find unfortunate, but I understand the point. So let's do this together. Let's send a strong message to the Olympic Committee, the IOC, that never again should they allow a country to host the Olympic Games that's engaged in genocide. This should be a message that every American can say together, that never a country should give them the prestige of hosting the Games when they're committing genocide. Never should a country be able to host the Games when it's something like what China is doing to the Uyghur population, enslaving them, stripping them of their dignity, their autonomy, their culture, controlling them in every way, enslaving them. Never again should the Games be able to be hosted by a country like China that's doing to the political rights of Hong Kong what China is doing, stripping the freedom of speech, stripping the freedom of assembly, and breaking the deal that it signed when the deal was struck with Britain for the return of Hong Kong. So this amendment, co-sponsored by Senator Rubio, who is the co-chair from the Senate of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, co-sponsored by Senator Romney, who knows more about the Olympic Games than anybody else in this country, co-sponsored by Senator Young, who has been a terrific champion for the abuse of citizens in Yemen and the abuse of citizens in Burma. Let's adopt this amendment as part of this package. While we are on the topic of China, while we are on the topic of trade, let's not let this moment bypass us without saying with a unified voice that this is wrong, and that the Olympics, which are designed to lift up the human spirit, to celebrate the best of competition, to have kind of the thrills and the agonies of victory and defeat, that never should the Games, the focal point of world attention, be hosted by a country that is committing genocide. Thank you, Mr. President.
And I want to thank my colleague for his leadership on this issue. He has been committed to human rights in Hong Kong for as long as I have known, and I think we all appreciate his leadership. Look, we approach this hearing in a mood of sadness. We have watched the Chinese central government tighten its grip on the free and open spirit of Hong Kong. We have witnessed authorities shutter institutions of democracy and free expression. We have seen our friends jailed to silence their voices, while others have fled into exile to allow their voices to be heard. And it is these voices that preserve hope and remind us that the distinctiveness of Hong Kong cannot be wiped away by fiat. Today, we welcome not just a status report, but recommendations for what policymakers in the United States and in other countries can do to address the erosion of human rights. In the last 2 years, Congress has passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, and the Protect Hong Kong Act, which I introduced. Pursuant to these authorities, the executive branch determined that Hong Kong is no longer sufficiently autonomous to warrant differential treatment and imposed sanctions on government officials complicit in undermining autonomy, democracy, and rights. What more can we do to try to change behavior? Can we move to revoke Hong Kong's distinct WTO status as its own customs territory? Can we leverage the spotlight of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics? The Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I also co-chair and Congressman Smith also is a member of, asked the International Olympics Committee to postpone and relocate the Games if the host Chinese government did not let up on the Uyghurs and Hong Kong. They refused. We asked the Olympic corporate sponsors to use their leverage to demand improvements in respect for human rights. They refused. We owe it to Hong Kongers and Uyghurs not to dignify the corrupt stain that is in the Beijing Olympics. I urge the Biden administration not to send U.S. officials and American sponsors, not to send their CEOs. In December, the White House will convene the Summit for Democracy. I urge the Biden administration to use this event to shine a light on Hong Kong, the democratic freedoms that the people of Hong Kong aspire to, and that the Chinese government is taking away are universal values. One practical thing we can do is provide humanitarian pathways for those fleeing the Chinese government's repression. The CECC will hold a hearing next Tuesday on proposed legislation, including the Hong Kong Safe Passage Act and the Hong Kong People's Freedom and Choice Act. And I welcome any thoughts our witnesses have on these bills. I wanted to say to the witnesses, I will be in and out. We have a Rules Committee meeting at 2:30, unfortunately, but I am eagerly awaiting any recommendations that you have on actions that we might take. But I thank you, and I thank the chair, and I yield back.
First, I just on the Olympics and the diplomatic boycott. Several reports the president has decided to move forward with the move. Is that correct, that he's come to this decision?
The Biden administration will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games, given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. The athletes on Team USA have our full support. We will be behind them 100% as we cheer them on from home, but we will not be contributing to the fanfare of the Games. U.S. diplomatic or official representation would treat these games as business as usual in the face of the PRC's egregious human rights abuses and atrocities in Xinjiang, and we simply can't do that. As the president has told President Xi, standing up for human rights is in the DNA of Americans. We have a fundamental commitment to promoting human rights, and we feel strongly in our position, and we will continue to take actions to advance human rights in China and beyond.
The Chinese Foreign Ministry has already suggested that there'll be countermeasures, firm countermeasures, I believe the term that they used. Have they indicated to the administration yet what sort of action that they might take for this move?
Well, I don't have anything to read out in terms of their intentions or what they would convey from officials from the PRC. But our view is that's not the right way to view or frame our relationship. Our view is that cooperation on transnational issues is not a favor to us. It is not a transaction. The PRC should be taking action on issues where the global community, to meet the needs of the global community. And that's what they should do in order to be a part of leadership in the global community. So I don't have anything to read out on their front. They can certainly speak for themselves.